I'm so excited that you're here on your Labor Day weekend. Happy Labor Day weekend, taking some time out of the long weekend to come and chill at One Church. Man, I don't know about you guys, but I love Labor Day weekend. There's nothing like having a Monday off. It's good. It's good. But man, I love Labor Day too because it means that we're getting into September, which means that we're getting into fall. And I love fall. Man, anything about fall. We got beautiful leaves in Ohio, and I am slightly ashamed to say that I also do very much love myself a pumpkin spice latte. I do. I'm ashamed, but I'm not ashamed. I had one this morning. It was delicious. Getting into fall, and I like the salted caramel one too, all right? And also fall means that we're heading into college football season. Come on, Buckeyes, where are you at? Where are you at? OH? Yes, come on. I have some good news. I'm a Columbus, Ohio guy, so I'm a Buckeye fan, but for some who are true Buckeye fans, you also might be a little sad to know that I married a South Carolina girl, so we are also Clemson fans, all right? And I've become a Clemson fan. We're a house divided, but it's cool. We're staying together. It's working okay. My name's Anthony Domine. If I haven't had a chance to meet you yet, I'm the campus pastor here in Gahanna. And by way of introduction, you may not know, but I am the husband of my beautiful wife, Calla. She was actually standing right here. Yeah, put it up for Calla. Actually, it's our first week back leading worship after our second was born, Nia, our baby girl. So it's a big week. Excited to kind of have her back in the saddle. Yeah, we have Nia, our new baby girl, who is a few months old now. And then Chambers, our son, who has just turned 3. And if you know anything about 3, he has lots of opinions. That's how I would define 3. Lots of opinions about things that you wouldn't think that you could have opinions about. I'll give you an example. We had a trick for a little while with Chambers where we would be giving him options to get us through things like getting him dressed, for example. So we'd say, hey, do you want the black pants or do you want the green pants? And for a while, he'd be like, green pants. And we're like, yes, you're on board. He's wise to that act now because now it's like, hey, dude, you want black pants or green pants? He's like, no pants. All right, I didn't think you could have an opinion like that, but I'm really excited to be continuing and actually taking up where Pastor Greg left us off last week, finishing his message series, The Satellite Prayer. We're going to be picking up right where he left off. And the Satellite Prayer was a series all around the book of Colossians and a chunk of verses where Paul was praying for the Colossians, a group of people he had never met. And we finished with a verse where Paul prayed for them that they would be filled with joy. Filled with joy. And the word that stood out to me in that was the word filled. Full. Being full. Feeling full, having a full life. And interestingly about Paul, too, and his ministry, so he prayed this for them, I think large in part because he had experienced it himself. He had experienced a full life. But this is interesting, too. Check this out. In Timothy, 2 Timothy 4:6, which is the last book, the last letter he ever wrote. So it's at the end of his ministry. He's done pretty much everything he's going to do in his ministry. And he writes this. As for me, my life has already been poured out as an offering to God. The time of my death is near, and I have fought the good fight. I have finished the race, and I have remained faithful. So Paul, with these verses, is introducing us to the concept we're going to be looking at today, which is what does it look like to live full and die empty? What does it look like to live full and die empty? To be able to say, hey, I want to pray for you that you can live full because I know what it's like to live full, but also that you could get to the end of your life and know that you left everything on the field. You squeezed every ounce of juice out of your life and you were proud of what you accomplished. You could say you've been poured out like an offering. You have run the race. You have fought with endurance and you've remained faithful. Living full and dying empty. For me, the first thing I think of when I think of fullness and empty, full, empty, the first thing I think of is a gas gauge. A gas gauge. Yeah, go ahead and put this up. Now, before we talk for another minute about this gas gauge, I have to settle a debate about this picture, okay? So we're going to take a minute looking at this picture because I know some of you would look at this picture and you would say, Anthony, that's not an empty gas gauge. I know some of you, like my wife, would look at this picture and you would say, listen, Anthony, that's like 10, 20, and if you're driving a Honda Civic, maybe like a hybrid, that's like 30, 40 more miles left in the tank. That's not an empty gas gauge. I'm the opposite, okay? My wife, she's gonna look at that and say, listen, Anthony, the gas light's not even on yet. You can drive that thing till we get to Kentucky, we're good. I'm the kind of guy that when we get like just past half full, I'm looking for gas stations. I'm like pulling up the GPS and we're in the middle of nowhere on a road trip. I'm going, whew, we're not gonna make it. For the sake of today though, we're gonna agree that this is an empty gas gauge, okay? Cool. So what I think's interesting, right? We all have gas gauge in our car. We all know what this looks like, what this feels like. But we also have a gas gauge as people. We also have a gauge as individuals for our energy, for how we're feeling in our life. And I know you might look at that gas tank, an empty gas tank, and be thinking about how you feel like you're living on E. You're driving the car on empty. And every single time you feel like you get to the gas station and you get filled up and you get back on the road, what you realize is that you actually only got filled up about a quarter tank, and next thing you know, you need another gas station. You need something else to fill you up because you just keep feeling like you're living on E. You're running on fumes, you're burning out, you're breaking down, your car's starting to shake, you're starting to shake. You feel like you're running on E. We have all been there. And I know there are people in the room today that are living on E, and you're tired. I know what it's like to go on E. I just told you I have 2 kids under 3, okay? We're all in those moments, okay? And but it can be daunting. It can feel lonely, and it can feel frustrating because you're just sick and tired of living on E. But Jesus doesn't want us to live on E. Jesus wants us to have a full life. In fact, in John 10:10, Jesus himself says this, "The thief comes only to steal and kill and destroy, but I, Jesus, have come that they," meaning you, "may have life and have it to the full." Jesus doesn't want you living your life on E. Jesus doesn't want you trying to just burn every single ounce of gas mileage out, suffocating, feeling like you can't get ahead. Jesus wants you to have life and have it to the full. That's what he came to do. To live full and to die empty. You know, when you're looking at your life and you're kind of trying to figure out where am I at on the gas gauge, really the question you're asking is, where's the next gas station? Where's the next gas can? Where can I get filled up and actually get some traction in my life? Where can I get out ahead? Where can I fill up my gas tank up all the way? What's the right kind of gas? You know, you can't just fill this thing up with a milkshake and put it in your car. It doesn't work. You got to get the right stuff. And you're asking yourself, how do I get actually full? How do I get the right gas in the gas tank and the gas can so that I can get my engine full and stop running on E? That's what we're going to be looking at today. Living full, dying empty, and where do we get the right kind of gas to fill us up? And we're going to do this by looking at a few things, a few people, all right? We're going to look at 2 psychologists and 2 people in the Bible, okay? We're going to start with 2 psychologists, then go 2 people in the Bible. And I know you guys are fired up about some psychology today, huh? Psychology 101. You didn't know you were going to your college class today, but we're going to Psychology 101. And we're going to start with a super exciting game. I know it's your favorite game, the Guess Who's This Psychologist game. Okay, you ready? All right, so here's what's going to happen. I'm going to count down 3, 2, 1. We're going to put up a picture on the screen, and you're going to yell out who that psychologist is, all right? You ready? Are you ready? Yeah. All right, are you ready to guess that psychologist? Put them up. 3, 2, 1, guess that psychologist. Freud. We have a winner. Put your hands together for the winner somewhere over here. Take them their prize. There's no prize. Sigmund Freud. Sigmund Freud is going to introduce us today into our delving into this concept of what does it look like to live a full life? What does it look like to be fully motivated, and what are you motivated by? And Freud in the late 1800s came out with what at the time was a groundbreaking study and still forms a lot of today's psychological thought on what motivates people. What motivates people? And he condensed it down to two things that Sigmund Freud would say motivates you. Sigmund Freud would say, basically, guys, you're pretty simple. We're pretty simple. You're really motivated by two things: the pursuit of pleasure and the avoidance of pain. The pursuit of pleasure and the avoidance of pain. That was Sigmund Freud's big thesis. That's what we are motivated by. Pure and simple. It's about pleasure and pain. Get a lot of pleasure, not any pain, and that's your formula for a full life. Now you hear that and you're thinking, maybe some merit to that. You know, it feels simple. Maybe discounting it. I will say this about this, though. I think that even though this philosophy here, this thought might feel a little bit limiting, I think a lot of us do kind of live in this space. That in our lives, we feel like we're running on E, and so what we're trying to do to get us out of this rut is we continue to just pursue pleasure. We're pursuing pleasure. We're pursuing things that we enjoy, and we're avoiding all of the hard things. We're pursuing, whatever food we want to eat, whatever enjoyment we want to just have on Netflix all the time. Listen, if I could live in a world where there was Netflix on just all the time, that'd be a world, right? But we pursue that, right? Whatever the best kind of job we can get to make the most money, the best possible house, the best possible car, all the conveniences. And we in the United States, we have kind of access to all sorts of pleasures, all sorts of conveniences, and we avoid a lot of pain. We don't want to go into that conflict. We don't want to go into that hard conversation. We don't want to go to the gym. I for one, don't want to go to the gym. Please don't make me go to the gym. All right, bench pressing for me is just embarrassing now. 31 years old, and it's just getting embarrassing. So I don't want to go to the gym. I'm avoiding pain. But there's an element of this that feels a little limiting. But what we're going to do is we're going to take Freud's thought, we're going to put it up over here for a second, and then we're going to go to psychologist number 2 and his thought on what is man motivated by. Okay, so Sigmund Freud's over here, and now we're going to do one more game of Guess That Psychologist. Are you ready? Okay, Guess That Psychologist. 3, 2, 1, put him up. Psychologist number 2. Hey! Pretty smart. So I'll be honest, I didn't know who this guy was 7 days ago, okay? So just introduced to him in my studies. This is a man by the name of Viktor Frankl. Oh yeah, Viktor Frankl. Viktor Frankl lived a amazing life, a very, very fascinating life, which ultimately led to him developing a new form of psychotherapy that became one of a few formative ways that we think about what motivates us. And it all comes from his history. Viktor Frankl was a psychologist who was a practicing psychiatrist in Vienna in the 40s. And in his practice, he began, and he had this budding career where he was in a psychiatric ward helping people on suicide watch. And during his time, he dove right into kind of a place where the least of these were being attended to. And he was very passionate about helping people in that mental state and walking them back from that thought process. And he was very successful at the beginning of his career. He helped 3,000 or so people in that time to be pulled back from that difficult part of their life, and was having a very helpful, impactful career. And then tragedy started to strike as the Nazis took over Vienna. And so when the Nazis took over Vienna, they started to inform some policies on governmental things, how things were regulated, but also they got into the nitty-gritty too of these psychiatric practices, and they were applying some very insidious things that Viktor Frankl took a heroic stance against, because what the Nazis were asking him and his colleagues to do was to indicate people that they would say were mentally ill or mentally unstable and then the Nazis were euthanizing them. But what Viktor Frankl did is he said, this is absurd. So what he started doing was lying on their notations so that the Nazis wouldn't know that they were in certain kind of states so that he could save their lives. So he was doing this. He was fighting against the Nazis, doing whatever he could to stop them from this terrible practice that they were trying to employ. And then the next rung of tragedy struck when Frankl, as a Jewish man in the 40s, with the Nazis taking over, was taken captive, him and his family, and transported to a concentration camp. When you're brought to a concentration camp, what happens is you're processed. So he's separated from his family. He's removed all of his clothes, shaved from head to toe, removed of anything that would define him as him. And what eventually happens is you end up walking up to a guard. And what Victor didn't know, what the people being brought into that didn't know at the time, but he learned later, is that guard had one job: to determine whether or not that person could work. And 95% of the people that got in front of that guard were sent instantly to be murdered in the gas chambers. But Viktor Frankl was one of around 5% who they looked him up and down and they said, okay, he can work. So he survived that, but not really a blessing, because now he's introduced into the working conditions of a concentration camp, which of course were horrific. He had what could only be described as a joke for clothes. They were rags, barely stayed on his body. They had shoes that had holes in them with no laces. If they tried to fabricate laces, they were beaten. Any opportunity that the guards have to chastise them emotionally or physically, they took the opportunity. They were sold into projects to be done with contractors and building railroads and public projects. They were doing this terrible work of just miles and miles of marching. They had typhoid outbreaks and just miserable conditions. But in the midst of that, Viktor Frankl did something incredible. He started stashing away little notations where he was writing down the details of his experience. I think at that time, probably thinking that it would be something left after his death. But he was taking down notes, analyzing what was happening to him and to those around him, this experience of him being dehumanized and him dehumanizing those around him. And what ended up coming out of that is that Viktor Frankl ended up surviving. He survived 4 concentration camps, 4. With terrible transportation in between both, barely survived, one of a few to have survived the Holocaust, and out of it came this book, a book called The Man's Search for Meaning. This book is the book that came from his writings in his time in the concentration camps, but also became the beginnings of a new form of psychotherapy that he called logos therapy, which basically means meaning therapy. Which basically means this. Sigmund Freud, he said, guys, man is all about the pursuit of pleasure and the avoidance of pain. Frankl said, actually, man is not motivated just by that. He specifically railed against Freud, and he said, that's too simple. I think man is motivated by meaning, by a life of meaning, not just a life of pleasure and pain. So who's right? We have 2 psychologists, 2 forms of thought. So now what we're going to do is we're going to take those 2 psychologists and we're going to compare them to 2 stories in the Bible, 2 case studies in the Bible, to see who is right. Who's right for this search for meaning, this full life, dying empty. And we're going to start with the story of a man named Solomon. Solomon was king of Israel. How many of you guys know David and Goliath? Right? Slingshot. David's son is Solomon. So David was king, became king, and then Solomon is David's son. Solomon became king. And Solomon lived a pretty amazing life. He had every kind of possible pleasure that you can imagine. I'm going to just read a little bit here about his life. 1 Kings 10, it talks about some of what his life was like. He invited the Queen of Sheba to come to his palaces, and this is what it says about her reaction. When the queen of Sheba realized how very wise Solomon was, and when she saw the palace he had built, she was overwhelmed. She was also amazed by the food on his table, the organization of his officials, the splendid clothing, the cupbearers, the burnt offerings Solomon made at the temple of the Lord. She was overwhelmed, and she was a queen. It also says this in 1 Kings. Each year, Solomon received about 25 tons of gold. 25 tons of gold. If any of you know Ron Swanson from Parks and Recreation, he says, I don't know how much money I have, but I know how much money I have in weight. That's Solomon. Okay, he's like 25 tons of gold. That's over $1 billion a year. $1 billion a year salary. He had incredible real estate, palaces, private garden parks, a personal staff, estimated over 10,000 to 30,000 servants, his own private zoo with exotic animals from around the world. That's like you having a zebra and a giraffe and a lion in your backyard with the staff to tend to them. So much wealth that silver became worthless to him. A ranch of 12,000 horses and 1,400 chariots. On-demand access by performances of his favorite artists, okay? That's like being at home this afternoon. You're done with church. You're resting. Pick up some food, get in front of the TV, and you start perusing through Netflix, Hulu, which we all know takes like 35 minutes to an hour. And then you just end up picking something you already watched, but I'm not feeling that. But what Solomon would do is he'd do that and he'd go, not feeling any of this. Hey, Beyonce, could you go ahead and come on in? I'd love to hear some of the Destiny's Child stuff, if you could. That'd be great. Do some pullbacks. I'm a survivor. I'm not going to give up. I'm a survivor. I'm not. Could you kind of take us there, Beyonce? That'd be awesome. Or that's like he's brushing his teeth. He's getting bored in the morning, and he's like, you know what? This is boring. Hey, Jimmy Fallon, could you go ahead and come on in? I missed the late night last night, and I'd love to hear, yeah, go ahead and come on in. This is Solomon's life. Seriously. That's seriously his life. 1,000 wives and concubines, rock star fame, and the highest IQ and the greatest insight of anyone in the world to that point. Brilliant man, the wisest man to ever live. This is Solomon. He had every kind of pleasure that you can imagine and avoided every possible pain. But check out what he says, okay, about his life. This is crazy. All that stuff. And in Ecclesiastes, Solomon recalling his life, he says this: everything is meaningless. Completely meaningless. Everything is wearisome beyond description. No matter how much we see, we are never satisfied. No matter how much we hear, we are not content. What Solomon is yelling to us from Ecclesiastes, from all of the wealth and things that he has, is, guys, it's wearisome. It's meaningless. It's like chasing the wind. You can have all this stuff. You can have everything your heart's desired. Stop going after it. Stop falling into the trap of just pursuing more things. Stop falling into the trap of just pursuing more pleasure, avoiding as much possible pain as you can. Stop falling into the Freudian way of thinking. I'm telling you guys, if you do it, it's meaningless. That's Solomon. Now let's look at Paul. We talked about Paul a little earlier in his letter to the Colossians. Paul is going to be our case study, looking at what does it look like for a life lived under Frankl's principles, Viktor Frankl. Paul did some amazing stuff. He wrote almost half of the New Testament. So if you pull up in your Bible, you go to the New Testament section and you grab half of it, like a chunk somewhere in there, Paul likely wrote what you're holding. He also started 14 of the early Christian churches. 14. Paul was instrumental in taking up the baton from where Jesus left off to continue the Christian church. Instrumental. Did some amazing things. Meaningful life. And like we know that he said, he was poured out. But also, look at this about his life, 2 Corinthians 11:24. He went through some stuff too, some crap, some pain, some suffering. 2 Corinthians 11:24. 5 different times the Jewish leaders gave me 39 lashes. That's with a whip. 3 times I was beaten with rods. Once I was stoned. 3 times I was shipwrecked. Once I spent a whole night and day adrift at sea. I have traveled on many long journeys. I have faced dangers from rivers and from robbers. Check this out. I've also faced danger from my own people, the Jews as well as the Gentiles. I've faced danger in the cities and in the deserts and on the seas, and I've faced danger from men who claim to be believers and are not. He's basically saying, I've experienced every kind of possible pain you can think of. Physical pain? Yeah, I've been there. Being adrift at sea, being lonely, feeling like I'm going to be dehydrated and die? Yeah, I've had that. He's in prison, beaten, and he had emotional, relational pain. People that said they were his friends, they let him down. They betrayed him. Experienced every kind of pain. This dude did not have a life that was informed by pleasure. But remember in 2 Timothy 4:6, he says, as for me, my life has already been poured out as an offering to God. The time of my death is near, but that's cool because I fought the good fight. I finished the race and I've remained faithful. A life of meaning. All right, so let's unpack it. How do we do this? How do we have a life of meaning? How do we have a life like Paul? We know that Frankl's approach is the right one. We don't want to have a life that's just about pleasure and avoiding pain. We want to have a life that means something. And just like Paul, we want to get to the end of our life and know that we died empty. We left it all out on the field. Frankl actually lays out for us 3 action steps in his work of how to have a meaningful life. He said that a meaningful life comes down to 3 things. First, work that is meaningful to you. Work that's making an impact and work that lights you up. Work that you are excited about. I want to talk about this for a minute because we all have jobs. We clock in, we clock out. And sometimes we get lost in just the day in, day out. And your job just sort of happens to you. And you reluctantly attend and you reluctantly go because you need the money or you need the paycheck. But we have 2 choices with our work because work is a part of life, but work is also an opportunity for us to find meaning. So we have 2 options. First, we may need to have the courage to stay at our jobs. We may have to have the courage to stay. If you know in your gut and you know in your heart and you know in your head, it's not time to leave your job just yet. Then you have to have the courage to stay. You have to have the courage to stay in the work that you're doing and know that God has placed you there for a reason. And take a minute to step outside, even just today, to look at your work and ascribe the meaning to it. Because it doesn't matter what you do, there is always meaning in your work. Because every job, whether it's garbage man, teacher, selling insurance, every job that there possibly is, all of it impacts the people around you. And it's less about what you do and it's more about how you do it. And all of that begins with having the courage to stay and to pursue what is the meaning in what I'm doing, because there is meaning in what you're doing. That's the first option. The second option would be to have the courage to leave. If you feel in your heart and you feel in your gut and you feel in your head, it's time to get out of there. You know that job's not for you, it's draining you, and it's not what God has called you to do, then have the courage to leave it. It can be scary to leave your job. It can be scary to get that resume ready and start sending it out. But if you know it's time to leave and that God is calling you into a life of meaning beyond that work, then it's time to have the courage to leave. That's work worth doing. The second thing Frankl said is how you get to a life of meaning is pursuing community. Living life in community, living life with your peers and your friends. Now, I'm an extroverted guy, but I have a lot of introverted tendencies too. I'm the kind of guy that I love being around people, but also a lot of times I get to the end of the day and I'm tired. I got plans with friends. We got plans with friends we're going to go hang with. And Cal and I, we get home and we sit down on the couch for a minute. And I'm just like, man, should we just bail? And sometimes that thought wins, unfortunately. But every single time we take the effort to dust ourselves off, get back up, get in the car, get the kids ready, and go out and hang with those people that we had plans with and we planned to hang out with, every single time, it's positive. And it's more relaxing than it would have been just sitting at home. And it's more enjoyable, and it feeds our souls. I don't know if you've experienced that in your life, but community is worth pursuing. But it takes effort, and it takes intentionality, and it takes a decision. It takes the decision to put yourself out there, to invest your time, to invest your energy, invest your effort in community. It takes an action. But it is worth it to pursue for your life of meaning. How you live your days is how you live your weeks, is how you live your months, is how you live your years, is how you live your life. So you got to start somewhere, and you got to take it one day at a time, and you have to pursue that community and be intentional with it. Otherwise, you'll get to the end of your life and not have people around you. The third is that our suffering would be redeemed for good. So 3 things, Viktor said, meaningful life. Work that you're passionate about. Community that does life with you. And third, that your suffering in your life is redeemed for good. Suffering, unfortunately, is a part of life. Pain is a part of life. Disappointment, discouragement, it's a part of life. But I think most of us spend more of our time trying to avoid suffering than we do spending time preparing for suffering. We spend most of our time avoiding pain, just like Freud said, and less of our time preparing for the inevitability of pain, discouragement, and disappointment. I don't want to be a downer this morning, but we have to prepare for the reality that there is going to be some disappointments in this life. But we also have a choice. We have a choice. We can take the suffering that we go through in our life, and we can choose to allow God to use the suffering for a purpose. Just 2 weeks ago, right here on this stage, Yolanda shared her story about how they lost their child to heart disease. Surprisingly, young child. Heartbreaking. But what Yolanda and her family were doing were taking the opportunity and making a stance against this pain and this suffering and saying, God, we want to allow this suffering, this misery, this massive disappointment and discouragement and pain in our lives, we want to allow it to be used by you, God. So she came out here on the stage to share the story, to share this reality, so that she could allow God to use the suffering for good. Listen, anybody can take something good and do something good with it. Only God can take something bad and do something good with it. Only God can do that. And all we have to do is just let God, allow him to use it. We got to put it out on the table and let him play a part in it. Viktor Frankl was a perfect example of this. What a man that lived suffering. There were times when he was in the concentration camps where he grew apathetic. Apathy, he didn't care. He lost total faith in humanity and in himself. But he describes a story nearing the time of the end of his time in the concentration camp where these men crowded around him and they knew who he was and they knew about his profession and they crowded around him. They were all contemplating suicide because at that point, what other option do you have? These guys were in pain. They didn't feel like people anymore. They huddled around Viktor and they said, Viktor, will you please encourage us with something? Tell us what to do, because we're giving up. And he encouraged them. He said, your suffering can be used for a purpose. When you can't change your situation, we are challenged to change ourselves. That's what Viktor said. When we can't change our situation, we are challenged to change ourselves. He encouraged them, hey, don't worry about your suffering right now. Take a minute and think about the people that you're suffering for, your friends and your family that aren't with you right now. Suffer in a way that would make them proud. What he was doing was he was forcing their viewpoint from themselves to on the world around them, beyond their circumstances. When you can't change your circumstances, we are challenged to change ourselves. But there's good news in this. what better place in the world is there than right in your seat, right where you are, to find work worth doing, community to do it with, and find suffering redeemed than right here in the church, right here where you are. This is what it's designed for, guys. This is it. This is why we have groups and teams and we do all this stuff together. We have church on Sunday because we believe that the church, all focused on each other. The church is each other, by the way. The church is the body of Christ, the body of Jesus. We believe that we can find a meaningful life together. And also, when we can't change our circumstance, we're challenged to change ourselves. That's what Viktor said. But guess what? We don't have to change ourselves by ourselves. We can't change our circumstances, and we don't have to come to them totally broken and have it fixed before we get to the solution. All we have to do with Jesus at the center is allow him into the suffering. John 10, he said this, remember, the enemy may come to steal, to kill, and to destroy, but I have come so that they may have life to the full. Jesus doesn't want you living on empty anymore. He doesn't want you searching for where you're gonna find all these solutions. He wants you living life to the full in him, and all we have to do is choose it. Each and every day, choose it. Choose him. Choose him as the solution. Choose him as this. I know you're living on E. I know you're tired. I know you're ready to give up. Find Jesus as your gas tank. Find Jesus as your gas can. Go back to Jesus as your gas can. He says, come to me, all of you who are weary and burdensome, and I will give you rest. He says, ask and the door will be open. All we have to do is come to him and bring him into it, and he will help us find meaning in all of this. Listen, all Frankl did was decode what God designed in you. All Frankl did was decode what God already built into you. That you want to have a meaningful life and do work that has an impact. That you want to do it with people and you want your suffering to be redeemed for good. All we have to do is give it to Jesus. Guys, if God can take this 12 million copies sold and formed how we see our lives today, and millions of people changed how they looked at their own life, if God can bring this out of a concentration camp, what can he do with your life? If he can bring this out of a concentration camp, what can he do with your life? What can he do with your suffering, with your ability to, the gifts that he's given you, the place that he's positioned you? All we have to do is allow him to be a part of that. Don't let the enemy steal your joy. Don't let the enemy steal your fullness anymore. Don't let the enemy come to seek, kill, and destroy, to take that from you, to define your life. Listen, guys, all we have to do, remember, let Jesus come in. Come to him. Come to him. Come to him. Right now, we're about to close again in the song we sang. Go ahead and stand to your feet. That hope has a name. You don't have to be hopeless anymore. You can be hopeful in Jesus' name. All we have to do is come to him and invite him. Stop living empty in yourself and start living full in him. But all we have to do is invite him in and remember that he is the hope that has a name, Jesus. Let's sing and worship.